Welcome back to the channel. This will be the best wildcard team for Gameweek 30. We are in the middle of an international break and we've got FA Cup matches towards the end of the month and a Tuesday deadline in early April, but there's still a long way to go until that happens. But a lot of FPL News Your Fantasy videos will be heading your way over the next couple of weeks. Any injury updates during these international matches will be covered on this channel. A best wildcard team, of course, is established here, and there could be an updated version closer to the deadline. Also my transfer plans, a transfer tips, my own team selection, and much more, especially in the case of live streams closer to when the Premier League returns, of course. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single upload or live stream for both FPL and UCL Fantasy, with the Champions League returning in early April for the quarterfinals. Follow me on X, Instagram, and Blue Sky, Dylan RCM, and check all the other links in the description below for my Patreon and the championships. For early access to my videos, amongst many other perks, the Discord server, FPL League, and Spotify can also be found in the description. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. In recent live streams, I've been asked quite frequently about the FA Cup and what that means for blank Gameweek 34, and as a consequence, double Gameweek 33. These are the FA Cup quarterfinals at the end of the month, once we're back from the international break and only several days before the Gameweek 30 deadline. Fulham versus Crystal Palace, Preston North End against Aston Villa, Bournemouth versus Manchester City, and Brighton versus Nottingham Forest. So we could get a new winner here. Man City, of course, have won it a couple of times in the last decade, and Preston North End won the FA Cup twice. But every other team, it has been ages since Aston Villa won the FA Cup, for example, and the others would be first-time winners. So it's a very interesting draw, but at the same time, apart from the Preston North End versus Aston Villa game, it's going to be very tight in a lot of these scenarios and very difficult to predict. So perhaps we could get some curveballs thrown at us for blank Gameweek 34 and double Gameweek 33 as a result. And it's also worth mentioning the permutations of what the FA Cup results would mean on blank Gameweek 34 specifically. So we've got Arsenal versus Crystal Palace first. So this will be a possible postponement if Crystal Palace beat Fulham in the FA Cup quarterfinals. In the case of Bournemouth versus Man United, and by the way, all these games are currently scheduled for Gameweek 34. If Bournemouth beat Man City, then Bournemouth and Man United will blank in Gameweek 34. Then with Brighton versus West Ham, that will be a blank if Brighton beat Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup quarterfinals. And we've also got Man City versus Aston Villa as another possible postponement. And that is the most likely, by the way, of all of these possible games and matchups to actually not go ahead in 34, because you need two things to happen for Man City versus Aston Villa to go ahead in that blank. So if Man City beat Bournemouth in the quarterfinals and or Aston Villa beat Preston North End, then that will be a blank. So that is the most likely of them all. I'd be very surprised if that ends up somehow going into Gameweek 34 and we have no doubles in 33 for either Aston Villa or Manchester City. Then we've got Nottingham Forest versus Brentford. So if Forest beat Brighton in the FA Cup quarterfinals, then both Forest and Brentford will blank in Gameweek 34. And Southampton versus Fulham. If Fulham beat Crystal Palace in the FA Cup quarterfinals, then those two teams, Southampton and Fulham, will blank in Gameweek 34. We do have 4 confirmed fixtures, and that has been the case for quite some time now, ever since the FA Cup round of 16, and that has been covered on this channel already. Chelsea versus Everton, Liverpool versus Spurs, Newcastle versus Ipswich Town, and Wolves against Leicester. All of those games are going ahead in blank Gameweek 34, so they will help you to navigate this blank without using the free hit, for example, and it could also allow you to be more aggressive with that chip and use it in Gameweek 33 as one point of reference there. There are different ways to use these chips, especially those with a full house, with the assistant manager, triple captain, and all of this jazz. And I have covered this in my recent streams. If you want to see a chip strategy video going into more detail and covering different scenarios, then let me know down in the comment section below and drop a like on this video. But I thought it was worth mentioning these permutations, blank Gameweek 34 and the FA Cup, so you're well aware of the players and teams you want to invest in on this wildcard and what that could mean for the long term, because ultimately you want to set yourself up nicely for the rest of the season. But I think with the wildcard, it also depends on your situation in terms of chips, because for some people with no chips left, apart from the wildcard, you have to play a bit differently to somebody else who has a full set, for example. And I think most of us will have 2 or 3 remaining, let's say. And in my case, I've got the bench boost, free hit, and the wildcard still in my back pocket. But let's now go into the best wildcard team for Gameweek 30. And as always, leave your suggestions down in the comment section below. My squad value has been all over the place recently, a bit like my rank and how the Saturday and Sunday were complete polar opposites as they have been all season. I will discuss that in my transfer plans video with a review of Blank Gameweek 29, which ended up not being too shabby for me in the end, but my squad value is 104.2 million overall. It is kind of rough an estimate. It does depend a lot on how much value you have tied up in certain players and have you had some of these options in your squad from the beginning, and that would help you maybe build a certain wildcard easier than it would be for other FPL managers watching. But I'll try to discuss alternatives in each position as I always do, and I think in the goalkeeper position, whilst I've always been quite consistent on the podium of the best options, there are maybe one or two others you want to consider because of Blank Gameweek 34, Double Gameweek 33, and also potentially future doubles, such as in Gameweek 36. Despite keeping clean sheets in back-to-back games against Arsenal and Man City, the banker was in 29, you could have said. Yet Sells only delivered 1 point after Nottingham Forest conceded 2 goals late on in their 4-2 victory against Ipswich Town away from home. And we saw a similar pattern against Southampton earlier this season. And it wasn't too long ago, actually. It was in 2025 when Nottingham Forest went 3-0 up and then took their foot off the gas and almost dropped points in that game and only won 3-2 in the end. So a similar pattern ensued against Ipswich Town, but Sells has still been the best goalkeeper so far this season, and with Jordan Pickford having terrible fixtures now and Everton looking shaky defensively, I still think Sells is the clear standout there. But David Raya, and with that Arsenal defence churning out more clean sheets and getting results despite not playing great football, that would be the main alternative to rival Matt Sells. But when you also consider Double Gameweek 32 and also the other doubles like I mentioned in 33 and 36 and also Blank Gameweek 34, that also puts a curveball in there, and maybe Dean Henderson could be a great pick in this position. But if you're quite keen on Daniel Munoz like I am, I'm not entirely sure about doubling up on Crystal Palace defensively, despite their very impressive recent form, because their fixtures overall aren't great. It's just that double in Gameweek 32 and facing Southampton away in Gameweek 30, which makes them very appealing right now. But I think in the long term, besides Mateta and Munoz, you don't need to have 3 Crystal Palace players in your setup. That's the way I look at things, and ultimately I would recommend one Nottingham Forest defender like Milenkovic, Nico Williams or Reina, with Milenkovic being my preference, which I have said on multiple occasions, and if not, Matt Sells in goal is a great option from now until the end of the season. But the backup goalkeeper won't be Areola this time. You can still feel free to go for him, and he's a decent option, but I'm going for Jose Sarr. He only costs 4.3 million, and he features in Blank Gameweek 34 with an appealing fixture against Leicester City. So that's the main reason why he's in here. But ultimately, you would be playing Sells week in, week out. Sarr would be on your bench, and I think this goalkeeper pairing is very solid for the rest of the campaign. The most informed defender in Fantasy Premier League is undoubtedly Daniel Munoz. He blanked in Gameweek 29 with Crystal Palace not featuring in their postponed fixture against Newcastle, which falls under Double Gameweek 32 now. But that makes him very appealing from this point onwards, facing Southampton away in Gameweek 30 and then having a decent double on paper, mainly from an attacking perspective. Maybe with the clean sheets, Crystal Palace aren't that appealing, and that's why I'd highly recommend Daniel Munoz over Lacroix, Gay, or Dean Henderson in goal. They're all good options, especially in the case of the shot stopper Dean Henderson, but I think Munoz, with the goals and assists for it, bombing forward, getting so many shots inside the box and all these chances for a wing-back, he is the most appealing, and at this price and below, you can't beat it right now. I know Robinson got 8 points against Spurs in Blank Gameweek 29, and you've got other choices like Milenkovic, but if I had to pick one defender at this price point, it would still be Daniel Munoz. I am going for 2 premium defenders though, and one of them is Gavardio. Man City are not convincing defensively whatsoever, I get it, but that fixture against Leicester looks amazing. I do think Man City can keep a clean sheet there, and long term, I'd expect Gavardio to add a few goals or assists. And it was actually at this point last year when Gavardio was one of the players who stepped up for Man City and helped them win the Premier League title with some really crucial goals. And I think for a left-back who is originally a centre-back by trade, he just has a really good shot on him. And he's another one like Daniel Munoz, who is very exciting to own in this position. And it will be quite against the template, let's say, going for Gavardio. Not many people will go for him, as most will gravitate towards Gabriel, which is still my recommendation overall if you had to pick one of them, simply because Arsenal have a much better defence than Man City this season. But why not go for both? That would be my saying. I think you can fit both of them in. It does mean some sacrifices elsewhere, and I completely get it that some people still want that 2 or 3 premium structure in the midfield and attack, and you can still achieve it, but that would probably require one of these defenders to be sold and downgraded to make the funds available. But Gabriel, for me, is a really solid choice. He got booked against Chelsea in that 1-0 victory and was very close to getting bonus points nonetheless, but he's a very solid option. Arsenal scored from a set piece for the first time in several months. I think their last direct goal from a set piece scenario was in December, and that was a welcome change there with Marino scoring the winner against Chelsea. And Gabriel will be obviously the target in most of these scenarios, and with Saka back, I think that's going to boost Gabriel's appeal even more. We could see that happen in Game Week 30. Maybe Saka won't be rushed that much against Fulham, and the priority will definitely be against Real Madrid in the Champions League, but that's something to monitor. I think Saka will make Gabriel a better FPL asset and vice versa. But next up, another team will be covered, and there will be no defensive double-ups in this wildcard setup. You can consider Dean Henderson in goal with Munoz, or perhaps Milenkovic with Sells. I think with the Forest defensive double-up, I'd be more keen, despite Crystal Palace's double. But I would go for Kirkes, who has been getting several assists in recent weeks. That's back-to-back weeks now where he has produced a return, despite the fact that Bournemouth have been in poor form, and I'm less keen on tripling up on the cherries now, but having one or two of their options is probably the sweet spot. You've got plenty of options in the midfield, Ivanosen up front, and the likes of Howson and Kirkes in this defensive line, and I would opt for Kirkes with the assist threat from open play if you have the funds. If you are struggling to really build to that sort of structure, you can maybe go for Milenkovic instead, or perhaps Dean Howson as a like-for-like replacement. But the final option will be quite surprising. He scored the opening goal in the Carabao Cup final against Liverpool, and that's Dan Burn. He's not going to score many goals, but he does have that threat from set pieces due to his sheer height, and I think in aerial situations he can be an absolute nuisance. So hopefully he's got 1 or 2 goals in store for us, but realistically we haven't seen that too often in this Premier League season. But to cover that Newcastle defence, with Lewis Hall out for the campaign, which is a big shame, he would have been a lock on this wildcard. I think Dan Burn or Livramento will be next in line, and a couple of days ago I did say I prefer Livramento. Maybe that goal in the Carabao Cup final has swayed me a little bit, and Dan Burn offers decent value at 4.4 million. But Newcastle aren't great defensively. They can set up very well against the best teams in the country like Liverpool and Arsenal and beat them in a one-off game. But I think over the course of a campaign, when they are more offensive, they leave some gaps at the back, and I just think their attackers are more appealing than their defenders or Nick Pope in goal. But they should still all be considered. I certainly wouldn't double up on Newcastle defensively nowadays, but having one of them, like Dan Burn, could do the job. It might seem like a case of what could have been for Liverpool, as they were in a Carabao Cup final. They lost it at the last hurdle against Newcastle, and they crashed out of the Champions League round of 16 against PSG, and we all expected them to go much further than they did, but they're still having a great campaign. Their Premier League season, of course, has been very consistent, and they've been the only Premier League club that have shown that level of consistency and performing in most weeks, and Salah's been a huge part of that. He scored a brace in Game Week 28 against Southampton, both of them from penalties. His own performances have dipped, though, against the likes of PSG and Newcastle in those cup competitions, but I still think he's worth including on a wild card. The thing is, though, you could argue, if you aren't looking to captain him from Game Week 30 onwards on most of these occasions, there is a case to go against him and go for Haaland. Maybe you still back Palmer to turn things around against Dr. Tottenham. That is all definitely worth considering, but I'd still put Mohamed Salah in here. It does make it difficult to have him and Erling Haaland in the same structure. It is possible, as I'll show you very soon, but I also think it's going to be difficult, and it does require some compromises in other positions. But Salah still makes it into this team, and if it's a question of going for him or Palmer, considering recent form, I'm still going to go for Mohamed Salah, as Palmer has fallen off a cliff recently, and he missed the game against Arsenal due to an injury. Hopefully he's back for Game Week 30 against Tottenham to make things even more interesting. But the next player in this setup will not be Bryan Mbeumo. It has been a while since he hasn't featured in one of these wildcard videos, but with Brentford's fixtures, I think there is the possibility to go against the template and find other players with better fixtures perhaps, or better form. And in this case, I'm going for the latter in Bruno Fernandes, who has been outstanding recently. He got a goal and 2 assists in blank Game Week 29 against Leicester, and it's a good thing he did, because my Game Week was going down the drain until the likes of Fernandes stepped up on the Sunday, and I think his consistency has been very impressive. He scored against Arsenal, Everton. He got back-to-back double-digit hauls, then 9 points against Arsenal, scored a hat-trick against Real Sociedad on Thursday night, and then followed that up with that massive haul against Leicester City, 17 points, and those that captain him will be very happy with his efforts. But we're also going to go for cheaper options like Justin Kluivert, who still makes it I think having 2 Bournemouth players is probably the sweet spot right now, and you could even trim that down to 1. I wouldn't advocate a triple up with Arneson up front. I think he's a good option still, but if I'm picking between him and Kluivert, I'm going to go for the Dutchman all day long with the penalty duties and a sheer consistency, which I don't think the other Bournemouth midfielders have really matched. And they have been very shaky recently, the Cherries, and a lot of their fans have been quite disappointed with their recent results and performances, but they're still having a great season and it will be their best ever Premier League campaign. But it does seem like maybe the wheels are falling off a little bit. They've got some good fixtures though, like Ipswich Town at home. For those with Semenyo, he's on 9 yellow cards after picking up his 3rd consecutive booking, which is very frustrating to say the least. I sold him in Game Week 29 as part of a -4 hit, but we'll get onto that in my transfer plans video. But we're also going to go for some interesting options to say the least. Before I show you a very wild pick in this wildcard squad, and I want you to hear me out when the time comes, I will go for a more solid option who's kind of more established here in Jarrod Bowen. I think he can be very useful for Double Gameweek 33. West Ham's fixtures aren't anything to kind of write home about, but it's still fairly decent, and Bowen is a talismanic figure. He played very well against Everton and was unlucky not to get another assist at least, but a 5-pointer in a week like blank Game Week 29 was still decent, and his consistency has been very impressive. He's not going to get those massive returns like a Bruno Fernandes or Salah, and even with a Cole Palmer in form, but what he can do is give you 5 to 8 points more often than not, and he has returned in 3 out of the last 4 Premier League matches. But the final midfielder is similarly priced to Jarrod Bowen, but he is suspended right now. He will be available just in time for Double Gameweek 32, where he could be a massive differential, and that's Anthony Gordon, which might be a very wild pick. I completely get it, but I'm very bullish that he can be a very decent differential who can complement your other Newcastle and Crystal Palace assets. If I'm building a team of the best options from those 2 teams, Daniel Munoz, Mateta and Isak stand out above the rest. But then you've got the likes of Gordon, Dean Henderson, Dan Burn, and these sorts of options that can really complement the rest, and you can have nice triple ups in both squads. And if you still want to have Gordon as well as Sa and Eze, you can do something similar and maybe sell Bruno Fernandes in the process, and others will have their eye on Bukayo Saka and when he returns from injury, and that will be a massive boost, a great differential as well with a very high ceiling. But I just urge a bit of caution with that particular pick right now. As I mentioned before, I think Arsenal will focus mainly on the Champions League, and that makes a lot of sense, but they'll still go quite strong in the Premier League. I'm not rated it as much as some people would suggest, but with Saka, it's a different circumstance. He has been out for several months for the first time in his career, and hopefully returns the same player and goes on to even bigger heights, but that would be another one to consider in the midfield. I have covered all of the latest updates on Jean-Philippe Mateta's injury, with Oliver Glasner providing a lot of clarity on the situation, and he's been very consistent saying that he expects Jean-Philippe Mateta to be available by the end of the month, just in time for the FA Cup quarterfinals, and that means he would be available for Game Week 30. Could there be a setback? That is always going to be a possibility with injured players, but I think Mateta will be ready to start against Southampton away. Could there be a case of rotation where Crystal Palace will go quite strong in the FA Cup? Maybe Mateta has a cameo off the bench and then starts against Southampton, or will it be the opposite where he gets the nod in the FA Cup and then Nketiah starts against Southampton? That's something you should bear in mind, and it is a risk, but I think Mateta's a great option to navigate Double Gameweek 32, and he was showing incredible form in this calendar year, matching the likes of Salah at the time before his injury in terms of Premier League goals scored. So I think Mateta's a great option, and between him and Chris Wood, as much as I've rated the Nottingham Forest talisman, I'd go for Mateta at this moment in time. Next up though, isn't Chris Wood. It's going to be Marmoush at a similar price, and this will be your kind of Man City attacking coverage. It is risky, and I'd definitely rather have Haaland, who is nailed on in that attack, as opposed to Foden and Marmoush, who are going to be in, then out, and you're going to have some headaches there with the starts as well. But I think Marmoush is a nice way to complement that Man City attack, and he's also a massive differential with an extremely high ceiling. He has blanked in 5 out of 7 matches in his Premier League career so far, but in those 2 matches where he has scored, there have been big returns. A hat-trick against Newcastle in a 4-0 win, and a goal and assist with a penalty earned against Brighton in a 2-2 draw. So I think Marmoush is a very good differential on paper. I've been recommending him in the last couple of weeks as a hold actually, even though he was benched against Nottingham Forest, and I was very bullish that he would start against Brighton and Leicester. But with this international break and the FA Cup match just before the Game Week 30 deadline, you should be slightly concerned about the Fodens and Marmoushes of the world. I think Haaland will be safe and should start against Leicester anyway, but that is something we're always going to have to be worried about with Pep Guardiola and maybe you want to tweak one or two things and go for more nailed-on strikers like Chris Wood or Erling Haaland, but that does require a reshuffle elsewhere. The final forward will not be any sort of rotation risk. He picked up an injury against Liverpool in the Carabao Cup final, but scored the second goal. He's one of the best strikers in world football. Alexander Isak has had a great season once again, and hopefully he can stay injury-free. But if there are no concerns with that injury, and it seems like it's all fine and good on that point, then he should be in your Gameweek 30 wildcard team. He is template, but you do have the differentials in Mateta, Marmoush, and in other positions such as Gordon, which will really help you in the next couple of weeks. So I'm very happy with this wildcard setup, but some of you might not feel the same way, and I completely get it. And in future weeks, for example, you can trim down one of these forwards or midfielders to a budget option, leave them on your bench, and then focus all of your funds on the starting 11. That's something to do after you have bench boosted. And for those that haven't used the chip already, Gameweek 33 or 36 looks like the best time to use that particular chip. But let's now go into FPL Team, talk about the starting 11 and the captaincy, and I'll also discuss other things you could do with this draft and another one which includes Erling Haaland. Between the sticks, I would go for Sels in goal. You might be tempted to go for Jose Sarr against West Ham, but I think the Hammers could get a goal or two in that game. I've gone for Munoz, Gavardio and Gabriel, which looks extremely solid for this week. Salah, Bowen, Cliver and Bruno Fernandes, who has been in great form. United have terrible fixtures, but with the way Bruno Fernandes is playing, I'd still be very bullish on some returns there. Isak, Marmoush and Mateta complete the front line, and the bench has Jose Sarr, Kirkes, Dan Burn and the suspended Anthony Gordon. But with just 2 transfers, you can radically change your team by doing something like this. Bruno Fernandes out for Saka, and then Gordon to a cheaper midfielder like Ismaila Sarr. And I have exactly the amount of money to do those sort of transfers. So that is another way of going a bit different. You don't have Erling Haaland or Palmer, which is maybe a negative point because they have an extremely high ceiling. But you do have the likes of Saka, a very strong front line, and a lot of squad depth, which is perfect for the bench boost in either Gameweek 33 or 36. And with the free hit chip, for example, I'd be using it in either 33 or 34, which I've been saying for the last couple of weeks now, for those that weren't planning to use it in the blank game week that just went by. But I'm very happy with this setup, and ultimately with Saka, I'd still be slightly careful with him, as I mentioned before, but that is a great differential, and if you want to go early on that, then I don't really blame you, but just be careful about having too many of these players who might be rotation risk in Gameweek 30, like Mateta, Saka, and maybe Marmoush as well. And that's why I've also gone for an Erling Haaland draft, and it's still quite similar. I've gone for Raya in goal instead of Sels to be a little bit different here. Munoz, Milenkovic, Gavardio, Salah, Bowen, Cliver, Ismaila Sarr, Chris Wood, Haaland and Mateta, with Jose Sarr, Kirkes, Murphy and Dan Burn. So I've gone for a slightly different Newcastle midfield coverage, which is significantly cheaper. You can still go for Eze as a differential over Ismaila Sarr, but the Senegalese winger does have very low ownership. I went there earlier this season and got burned, but he has a very high ceiling and he could do something against Southampton away, and most importantly for the double in Gameweek 32. If you're unhappy with certain picks like Gavardio, you can always tweak them to your liking. So for example, Gavardio to Gabriel could work extremely well. Then you can do Raya back down to Sels or Dean Henderson. Those are the goalkeepers I'd mainly recommend right now. Jordan Pickford is still decent, but I'd be less keen on him at this moment in time. But it's just another one that could really do the job for you. And I've got a bit of value tied up in Sels, so I'd have even more money left in the bank. It's worth mentioning that. But I'm very happy with this squad. The captaincy debate, I'll talk more about that in future videos and podcasts where I'll make the graphics for the top 10 captaincy options. But for me, Salah and Haaland will be the top 2. And I think Cole Palmer is still right up there against Tottenham at home, assuming he's fit and available for that game. Dr. Tottenham could definitely help Cole Palmer get back into form. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Do you prefer this wildcard draft or the one I showed you before? Are you going for Bukayo Saka and going very early for the Arsenal winger who could be available as soon as Gameweek 30? There are going to be some differences now in the final stretch of the season and a few different factors coming in, the Champions League, FA Cup and key players returning from injury, which will make FPL even more exciting, and all of that will be covered on this channel. And there we have it. The best wildcard team for Gameweek 30 has been highlighted with some key differentials also showcased, which will be very crucial in the last couple of months of this season. In terms of the best time to wildcard, Gameweek 30 or 31 does stand out, but there is also a strategy to wildcard in 35 and perhaps use the free hit in Gameweek 33, for example, then use free transfers for blank Gameweek 34, and then wildcard in 35 to set up a Gameweek 36 bench boost. There are different ways of playing it. As I mentioned before, if you want to see a chip strategy guide, then let me know down in the comment section below. With double Gameweek 33 announcements, we could get that in Gameweek 31, but of course the FA Cup quarterfinals will occur just before the Gameweek 30 deadline, so we'll have clarity on blank Gameweek 34 just beforehand, and that will be very helpful for those wildcarding in Gameweek 30. Thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it insightful, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single upload or live stream for both FPL and UCL Fantasy. Follow me on X, Instagram and Blue Sky, DylanRCM, and check all the links in the description below for my Patreon and the championships, for early access to my videos, amongst many other perks. The Discord server, FPL League and Spotify can also be found in the description. I hope you enjoy the international break, and I'll see you in the next deadline stream.